It's been a while because apparently developing a game takes way more time than I anticipated. And if you're new, my name is Thor and I'm developing a game aboard a giant vehicle in a frozen wasteland where you have to fight for your survival. And as I have alluded to in earlier devlogs, this is the first game I'm making, and therefore I have no experience with creating enemies before. I do however have some ideas for how it should be created, by using state machines to better model intelligent behaviors without having super unreadable spaghetti code. Doing this in ECS is however a bit more different than it would be with mono behaviors. Additionally, I need to do a bunch of research before I can implement any sort of state machine, which is why I have no human enemies as of yet. What I do however have is the beginnings of enemies in my game. As in, I have some vehicles that spawn in a small cluster and in some random direction away from the player, and then drive towards the player before they reach the chase distance and start circling the vehicle. This behavior is intended to mimic vultures, as the bandits are circling the prey, waiting to strike, while their turrets are shooting towards the vehicle and the player. The idea is for there to be human enemies that leave these vehicles to run to attack the vehicle, but that is a lot further down the road. But for the moment, this is as far I've gotten with the enemies, since I need to research how to do proper state machines in ECS before I can continue. As if I just try to use a bunch of if statements and cobble together intelligence, it's going to be very error prone. Therefore, I have to change topics for this devlog away from the enemies and towards turrets and gunplay, where currently the only turrets in the game are the playable turrets and those on top of enemy vehicles. These turrets are very simple. They loop over all entities, matching their targeting queries, which is an entity with a targetable component and matching the opposite of the turret's enemy status. As in, entities with an enemy component target those without, and vice versa, which means that the player's turrets don't target entities without an enemy tag and therefore don't shoot the player. They then just select the closest valid target that they have a line of sight towards and use that as their target to shoot. Calculating where to aim in order to hit was a bit more difficult than I had estimated. Seeing how gravity is applied to the bullets in my game, you don't just aim at a target directly, but instead you have to shoot upwards to counteract gravity, which can be calculated with a normal 2D parabola, even though it's a 3-dimensional targeting problem. However, I am bad at maths, and therefore I did not go with this solution. I instead went for the solution of iteratively accounting for gravity by letting the turret calculate the distance to the target, how long time it'd take for a bullet to reach the target if you fly in a straight line, calculated the height lost due to gravity over that time, and then aiming that much above the target. Rinse and repeat until it's sufficiently accurate, and you've got turret targeting. The turret then rotates to look at this new targeted position and only shoots if it's aiming enough in the desired direction, where turrets with a higher accuracy modifier will only shoot if they're more accurately matching the target direction to make sure they don't miss. They also rotate faster, so that turrets with a higher accuracy can better keep up with moving targets and also a hit. Additionally, they will also be able to more accurately predict where the target is going to be after a certain amount of time, so that turrets and enemies account for target movement by calculating the average velocity over X amount of frames, and then shooting at a position in front of the target given their velocity and bullet travel time. This movement counteracting needs to happen over some amount of time, so enemies and turrets aren't 100% accurate all the time, but slowly account for the target moving in the same direction, which would make strafing and direction changes a valid tactic against enemies. Additionally, it would facilitate adding enemies with the ability to dodge turrets by driving or running erratically or otherwise not moving in a straight line. However, rotating the entire turret leads to some slightly unintended consequences where it goes a bit crazy. So, I need to change the behavior of the turrets to rotate the base of the turret around the Y-axis and then only rotate the barrel of the gun up and down, with some angle limits imposed on it to make turret upgrading worthwhile. Additionally, having turrets with unlimited ammo in a game where resources are supposed to be scarce doesn't make any sense. So you have to convert resources into ammo and then refuel your turrets in order for them to be able to defend you, which is going to bring an extra difficulty factor into the game, from having to balance how many resources you convert into ammo and how much you burn in the generator, as well as spending time refueling turrets or doing the fighting yourself. Furthermore, I was thinking about adding more stuff to do on the ship, such as a more involved upgrading system or the vehicle being able to get damaged, but that is also going to happen at a much later date, if at all. But in order to be able to actually refuel turrets, they need to have an inventory attached to them. Unfortunately, the only inventories I have are mono behavior inventories, that are very finicky to bind to entities, as there is a lot of extra work involved in binding them, as well as communication between them for updating the inventories. Therefore, I had to remake the inventories to be easy as components, and while I was doing that, I also remade all the systems for the inventory UI and interaction capabilities to be easier to expand and add functionality to, and also be more performant. The mono behavior solution created an UI for each and every inventory that existed, which means that there's a lot of bloat if you were to have many inventories. For example, player, the vehicle has a furnace, upgrade and collection inventory, any turrets, any chests, enemies, and you can see how it would quickly spiral out of control, especially since each inventory UI is multiple game objects, so it could easily become an issue in the future. Since there can only ever be 2 active inventory UIs at any one time, the player's inventory and the one you're interacting with, we can make a pretty significant design change. The new solution instead has a 1 inventory UI that can display 2 inventories, an upper and lower inventory. And whenever it gets opened, we send 2 inventory references to it, so it can easily update the correct inventories when the player interacts with the UI. Another benefit is that the code is a lot more simple, and with 5 lines of code, we now have shift clicking to move items between 2 inventories. What this means for you, the player, is that it should be more performant, especially when a lot of inventories are present, and it should be less error prone. On a very different tangent, if we talk graphics, 4 days after the last devlog, Unity released an update that fixed an issue I was having with the snow deformation, where having multiple cameras severely dropped the frame rate down to around 50 FPS. But now we can have snow deformation for the player and vehicles as well as enemies, all with hundreds of frames per second. As another graphical change, I also tried converting my game to the high definition render pipeline, HDRP, to see if the graphical improvement over the universal render pipeline, URP, was large enough to warrant such a major change. It took around a day to get everything converted, and although the graphics were more realistic and looked good, the loss in frame rate was anything but, dropping from around 250 to 300 FPS to down to around 150. Granted, 150 FPS is not bad, but it's also far from good, considering that there really isn't enough going on visually in my game to warrant this. Additionally, I don't think that using URP is going to limit the graphical capabilities of my game, as I will more than likely be the limiting factor. But if we now shift to a very important part of almost any first-person shooter game, the gunplay. I have actually added proper gunplay into my game instead of just spewing bullets. For my game, I wanted gunplay that resembles that of Apex and Titanfall with a decently high time to kill, or TTK, as I like having aim and tracking being a necessary skill. Therefore, in order to achieve this, I started in a bit of an odd way, but a necessary way, by refactoring the shooting code to use stats derived from guns, also known as ranged weapons, where I can now have shooting stats per gun instead of hard-coded into the systems, which means that different guns can now have different fire rates, magazine sizes, reload speeds, and bullet properties. The only gun model I have currently is a temporarily borrowed AK-47 model, until I figure out both what type of guns I want in my game, as well as whether or not I should model them myself or find some assets to use. Having infinite ammo is also not that entertaining, as it goes against the previously mentioned resource scarcity. So adding ammo requirements to guns seemed like a worthwhile start. After that, I added magazines and the ability to reload guns using resources from your inventory. After this groundwork, we could finally begin on the important task of having recoils for guns. I have quite a bit of playtime in Apex and CSGO, and I want my gunplay to resemble that of Apex. Bro, I'm bad! I'm so bad! They're worse! So I found a nice tutorial for how to have procedural recoil like the one found in Apex, which I then had to convert both to dots and adapt to working together with the rival character controller. Seeing how I haven't written the code for rival, understanding how to correctly change its variables and behavior is pretty difficult, as it is an advanced control. Instead, I edited parts of the code to read a recoil quaternion generated from the shooting systems and add that on top of the camera's quaternion. However, this made the camera able to rotate way too much, which is, albeit fun, not quite what I want. Therefore, I had to rotate the camera limits, plus minus 90 degrees, to be equal to straight up and straight down in world space, which was done by rotating the limits with the current recoil amount. For example, if the current recoil is 17 degrees up from the player's point of view, then we have to rotate the camera limits 17 degrees down. So the upper limit is 73 degrees and the lower limit is minus 103 degrees, from straight ahead being 0 degrees. So it's still a 180 degree span, but it's now shifted correct. So we now have recoil per gun, where we can change how much recoil in degrees per axis, as well as how fast is your recoil and the speed of recovery. For example, if I were to have a big gun with a slow fire rate, such as a Kraber from Titanfall and Apex, or a big revolver, then it would have some really high upper limits on the recoil, as well as a fast recoil and a slow recovery time, since that will make the gun jolt quickly, far away from the original aiming position, and then slowly go back to where you were aiming. In many FPS games, for example Apex, you can counteract the recoil, which then overrides the recovery status and doesn't reset your view, so to speak. This was actually one of the most difficult things to implement for my recoil system, since if you counteracted the recoil, it is still recover from recoil once you stop shooting, and then you end up looking into the ground. Therefore, I had to make it so that if you counteract recoil, it doesn't recover from it, which should be pretty easy and feel good to play. However, it was far from easy to implement. Additionally, in Apex, unless you move your mouse fast enough, there is still a recovery period, as I want recoil control and proper aim to be an important part of my game. However, once I had managed to figure out the recoil system to work as intended, there was one more problem: that seeing whether or not your bullets are hitting is pretty difficult, as there's no visual impact. So I figured, why not add some decals? Surely it'll only take a few minutes, and it did. It was very easy to use the built-in decals in Unity Europe using an object pool, so that there is a max amount of bullet holes present, but there was one slight problem. The main structure in my game moves, and the decals don't move with the vehicle. This is because they are game objects that have zero knowledge about the ECS world. And although I could fix this by spawning a game object decal, as well as an entity that does nothing more than follow the ship and copy its position to a coupled decal, however, this would be very slow, as the performance with game object decals is already pretty lackluster, so I instead went with the much more logical decision of finding a tutorial for how to make my own decal shaders, and use that instead in order to have ECS decals. Because now these decals can attach directly to the ship following system and be updated in real time with great multi-threaded performance. As you can see here, I've got a bit more than 5,000 bullet holes on the ship, all of them following the movement of the ship while running at more than 100 FPS, which I'd say is pretty darn good, seeing how all bullet decals are going to despawn after 100 seconds, or once there is too many of them. So that is all of the fundamentals for my gunplay done, with the exception of some VFX and some minor changes such as potential hit markers or damage UI that I may or may not add, as I have already implemented a audio pooling system that plays an audio event at the barrel of the gun. However, some other changes I've done is that the large storm that was chasing the player at all times is now a gun, replaced by multiple minor storms that spawn in a random location with a random size, moving towards some target position, leading to some more interesting gameplay with more choices, as you can double back on yourself to get more resources, or try to outrun raiders by going through storms. Although that intelligence is not part of the raiders AI just yet, but I am planning on making them avoid storms, so that would be a valid tactic. It was also slightly inspired by the scene in Mad Max, where there's a large sandstorm with sand tornadoes inside, but my designs of the storms is a bit too cubical, but I'll try to figure out a better look for them. At least something more natural looking than a cube. Right, that's the entirety of the devlog. Thanks for sticking around. And if you don't want to miss the following devlogs, you can always subscribe, and if you don't like it, well, unsubscribe. But again, thanks for watching, and goodbye.